October 1st, the silvery wing of the aircraft sliced through the air as we flew high above the Pacific on our way to Nepal. Michael, on the right, gathered a group of friends and hired me to organize a trek to the Everest region, the highest place on Earth. Kathmandu is a city whose history blends with mythology and religion. Swayambhunath Stupa on the hill is venerated as the spot where in ancient times a lotus is said to have floated on a lake which covered the Kathmandu Valley. Out of the lotus burned a flame, Swayambhu, the self-creating god. As he did in ancient times, the wrathful god, Bhairav, protects the city and its inhabitants. The Nepalis share their world with many gods, goddesses, and spirits. Isolated from the rest of the world for millennia, Nepal only became accessible to outsiders in the early 1950s. The population of this small nation, set in the midst of the most rugged mountains on Earth, consists of people from dozens of different tribal and ethnic groups. Our second day in Nepal began with a visit to Patan. This old and fascinating city is inhabited primarily by a people called Newars. They are the original inhabitants of the Kathmandu Valley, their civilization dating back to the 6th century BC. Today, the Newars are small shopkeepers, big businessmen, farmers, and craftsmen. Most practice a unique religion, combining features of both Buddhism and Hinduism. Tom is a computer programmer and an avid hiker. His 16-year-old daughter Karen is a freshman in high school. Alex is a student at UC Berkeley. Anita works in computer sales. Pashupatinath, situated on the banks of the holy Bagmati River, is the most sacred Hindu temple in Nepal. Pashupati is an aspect of Shiva, Lord of Death, who is worshipped by offerings of water splashed onto an effigy of his penis. Pilgrims come from all over India and Nepal to worship at Pashupatinath. The morning to begin our trek finally arrived. All of our gear was loaded onto a minibus, and we climbed aboard with 16 porters, cooks, and guides. "16-year-old Michelle was scared. She didn't know whether she would be able to walk all the way to the Everest region. 3 hours later, we arrived in Lamusangu,
elevation 2,541 feet. The trek from Lamusangu to the Eastern Himalayas proceeds from west to east, crossing 6 major ridges en route to the Everest region. The ascent is steep, especially in the beginning, and in a matter of minutes we had gained several hundred feet in elevation and could look back down on the Kosi River and Lamusangu. Most of the population in the lower Himalayan foothills is either Chetri or Brahmin, Hindu people whose ancestors came north from India, or Tamangs who arrived from Tibet about 800 years ago. After climbing the steep trail under the intense sun for about 2 hours, a break for lunch was quite welcome. Angnima Sherpa, our cook and crew boss, prepared the first of 77 meals he would cook for us over the next 26 days. We spent the entire afternoon ascending towards Pakar. After dinner, we crawled into our tents, exhausted but pleased with the nearly 4,000-foot gain in elevation we had accomplished our first day. When we awoke at 6 a.m. the morning of October 5th, the air was cool and misty. We had about a half an hour before breakfast to pack up all of our gear and get ready to trek.
The ascent from Pakar to Moldy, situated at 8,382 feet, was very steep and difficult. As if to tease us, Numbar Himal poked its peak above the clouds. The next morning, we followed the Charnawati River through the rice paddies. The mature plants were heavy with the ripe grain and ready for harvesting, a task done exclusively by the women of the villages.
We ate lunch in Doban under some shady pines at the fork of 2 rivers. Swimming in the cold Himalayan river was fun and invigorating on this hot day when the air temperatures reached into the high 80s.
Refreshed by our swim, we made the steep climb away from the river. Next day at Karantichop, the trail descended through pines and then through a sal forest to the Boti Kosi River. We then crossed a suspension bridge, imported from Aberdeen, Scotland of all places, and immediately began our steep ascent through a damp and cool forest. Looking back across the river valley about an hour later, we could see the trail we had followed down the mountain. Water buffalo are very numerous in Nepal. These valuable animals provide milk, meat, and dung, which is used for fuel and fertilizer. The children were dressed in their best clothing for a holiday called Tika. They had placed pieces of colored rice on each other's foreheads as a mark of good luck and affection.
भन्नु दाइ आँसुको सागरी बगाउँदै चेलीले सिन्दुर पुछेको नराम्रो लाग्छ मलाई बिधुवा रुँदै हिँडेको किन रुन्छौ चेली तिमी आफूलाई कमजोर ठानेर हुने छैन सागर बगाउँदै चेलीले सिन्दुर पुछेको नराम्रो लाग्छ मलाई बिधुवा रुँदै हिँडेको आकाशको जुन जस्तै अँध्यारोलाई चिन्दै हिँड्दा.
Nima, with the help of Tsering, our guide, took advantage of our first rest day to take stock of our food. With the exception of some fresh vegetables and chickens, which we could sometimes purchase on the trail, all of our food had to be carried with us. Nima was born in the Khumbu, the high mountainous area of Nepal where we were headed, but like a lot of other Sherpas, he now lives in India, where the climate is less severe and the farming easier.
Excellent views of Mount Gauri Shankar on the left and Numbar Himal were our reward for climbing the steep trail out of Yasur early the next morning. At 8,250 feet, we had just crossed the second major ridge on our route. Almost immediately, we started our steep and slippery descent into the beautiful Sikri Valley. That afternoon, we crossed yet another ridge and descended into the Khimti Kola Valley. We followed the Khimti Kola upstream until we approached the village of Tosa. Tosa is the largest bazaar between Lamusangu, where we started, and Namche Bazaar, and to our delight, we were able to buy Nepalese beer carried all the way in from Kathmandu. We encountered our first mani walls the seventh day on the trail. They're built of stones that have been carved with the Tibetan Buddhist mantra, Om Mani Padme Hum. This sacred mantra is daily on the lips and in the hearts and minds of hundreds of thousands of Sherpas and Tibetans throughout Nepal, Tibet, and India. We followed the river through the Khimti Kola Valley, enjoying the rare chance to trek on flat ground for a while. Eventually, we reached Shivalaya, where the trail ascended steeply through the forest and up to the pass at Durali. A passing Westerner told us that Anwar Sadat had been assassinated the previous day. Shocked and saddened by this story, we were nevertheless amazed that this news had reached into this remote region of the mountains so quickly. The very large Mani Wall at this, our third major pass, confirmed that the area we were trekking in was dominated by Sherpa culture. The Sherpas, who are now Nepalese, came to this region from Tibet more than 600 years ago. From Durali at 8,952 feet, we had a beautiful view of the Liku Kola Valley below and the village of Bandar, where we would spend the night. The Sherpas who inhabit the valleys in this lush and fertile area known as the Solu are much better off economically than their brothers and sisters who live in the rugged, high mountain area known as the Khumbu. A weather pattern of hot mornings followed by foggy afternoons had developed. Often we could stand hundreds of feet above it and watch the fog climb up the mountain towards us, eventually engulfing us in its damp, cold, and dulling mists. Descending to Bandar, we pass some Zomchuk, half cow and half yak. Their long hair makes them well suited to the 6,000 to 13,000 foot elevations where they live. Leaving Bandar the next day, the trail descended into a steep canyon. It wasn't until late afternoon that we began the difficult ascent to our fourth major pass, Lamjura Ridge. At 11,649 feet, Lamjura Ridge would be the highest spot reached on our trek up to this point. After several more hours of trekking, we had climbed as far as Seti, a small monastic community where, cold and very tired, we spent the night. Day 9, we continued our long climb to Lamjura Ridge. Each passing day brought us closer to the high Himal and even more spectacular views of the mountains and valleys. After ascending for several hours, we reached the pass at Lamjura Ridge. Although we were at an elevation of more than 11,000 feet, we all felt fine. In fact, I felt much better here in the cool mountain air than I did in the hot, humid lowlands. Walking on a little further, we entered the damp, moss-covered rhododendron tree forest. Although they appear dead now, strangled by the mosses that clung to their twisted limbs, I knew that these same trees would cover the mountain with splashes of white, pink, and red as they burst into flowers in late March and April. As I neared the end of the pass, I was bewildered and amused by the strange singing that I heard off in the distance.
Unos fanfarrones que cuando van por la calle van robando corazones y si no se les quita bailando los colores a la policía y si no se les quita bailando
We had the great pleasure of walking along with this friendly group of Spanish mountain climbers for the next few days. We would meet them again in Lukla at the end of our trek. The trail down from Lamjura Pass to Jumbezi was steep, slippery, and very long. Jumbezi, set in the midst of the fertile valley below, appeared peaceful and inviting after the primitive and rugged Lamjura Pass and the difficult trail leading down. The thought that I could rest here the next day, that I wouldn't have to walk an inch if I didn't want to, was comforting and helped me carry on until I reached our camping place at the school in the middle of the Sherpa village. Built by the townspeople from funds provided by Sir Edmund Hillary's Himalayan Foundation, the school serves children from villages as far as 15 miles away. A veranda was being added so that the students could study outdoors during the hot, rainy monsoon season. Day 10 was a day for resting and exploring Jumbezi. Numbar Himal towers above the village. Every Sherpa village has a stupa, which are reliquaries containing the remains of holy people, lamas, or unused scriptures. After the wheat has been harvested, it must be threshed. Grounded in the cycles of nature, such as the planting and harvesting seasons, the day-to-day activity of each villager is quite similar to that of his or her neighbors. Day 11, we climbed out of Jumbezi and crossed a ridge. Then, turning a corner, we unexpectedly came upon this sight, Mount Everest, at 29,028 feet, the top of the world. Several hours later, we had ascended to our next major pass, Trokshindo Ridge, at 10,560 feet. Descending towards Manidingma, we passed the isolated Trokshindo Monastery. Next morning at dawn, we could see Khumbu, god of the Khumbu, glowing as the first rays of the morning sun hit its peaks. This mountain is revered by the Sherpas of Khumbu as the home of their god. Alex was very ill with a bad case of dysentery or food poisoning. He had painful cramps and threw up frequently. He also felt very weak, which made the long ascent from the Dudkosi River to Bupsa Ridge very difficult for him. After lunch and a brief but needed rest, we spent 3 hours climbing in the hot afternoon sun to Karte, where we spent the night, ending our 12th day of strenuous trekking up and down these very steep mountains. Feeling rested after a good night's sleep, we left Karte, and entering the forest, we snaked our way up the trail to Bupsa Ridge. At 10,329 feet, Bupsa Ridge is the 6th and last major ridge on our way to Khumbu. Recovering from his bout with dysentery, Alex still felt very weak, and the long climb demanded all of his strength and determination. Realizing that we would use Lukla's sloped runway to fly back to Kathmandu in 2 weeks was terrifying. The residents of this hermitage obviously don't want many visitors. We spent the night in Chaumrikarka and next day had a relatively short trek, 4.5 hours, to Jorsala. The trail followed the Dud Kosi north for a while as it meandered through the Dud Kosi Valley. Beyond Jorsala is the entrance to Sagarmatha National Park. The park was founded largely through the efforts of Sir Edmund Hillary in order to preserve the ecology of this unique area. Sagarmatha is the Nepali name for the mountain we call Everest. After entering the park, we continued to follow the Dud Kosi northwards, then began our steep ascent away from the river to Namche Bazaar. About an hour below Namche, we were very excited when we discovered we had another view of Mount Everest. Namche Bazaar, elevation 11,300 feet, is the largest Sherpa settlement. Our arrival in Namche marked a milestone on our journey. We were now truly in the high country, the Khumbu region of the Eastern Himalayas. Despite their close affinity with Tibetan culture, language, and religion, the Sherpas consider themselves as much Nepalese as do any of the other ethnic groups living in Nepal. Wherever Sherpas live, like here in Namche Bazaar, their settlements are the highest in the region. After walking for more than 2 weeks through the peaceful Nepalese countryside, not hearing anything louder than the sounds of a river, it was very disturbing to be assaulted by the roar and whine of a helicopter which carried a UN doctor back to Kathmandu. We camped beside Angnima's cousin's house. His name is Angkami, and he would be our host and guide in the Khumbu area. October 19th, day 16 of our trek was a day for rest and acclimatization. By the time we finished breakfast, the sun had warmed the air. While the others explored Namche, Angnima and I went off for a visit to his relatives in Tami, a few hours to the northwest. As we climbed out of Namche, we could see Amadablam off in the distance. It's considered the most beautiful mountain in the world by many climbers. Farming in Khumbu is limited. Consequently, Khumbu Sherpas concentrate their efforts on animal husbandry, herding yak, zomchuk, and goats, grazing them along the grassy alpine slopes. Mountains of stone, houses of stone, stone boulders and stone walls. Stones, 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 everywhere stones. The people who live in this area are quite poor. Their environment is harsh, and scratching a living out of the stony, sandy soil is very difficult. The air felt very cold when we awoke early the next morning. We enjoyed a warming breakfast, cooked for us by Angkami's wife, before setting off again. We had developed close and warm feelings for Angkami's family in the day and a half we were their guests in Namche Bazaar. Most of our porters returned home from Namche. They didn't have adequate clothing for the higher elevations. All of our gear would be carried by these 2 yak and 3 zomchuk from Namche onward. As we walked out of Namche, we were completely surrounded by the huge mountains. I could see Everest's peak on the left, Lhotse in the middle, and on the right, Ama Dablam. Tengboche Monastery sits on a ridge, looking up at these giants. Descending to the river, we came to the village of Pungitanga. Here, flowing water is used to spin prayer wheels, sending the sacred mantra, Om Mani Padme Hum, out into the universe for the benefit of all sentient beings. About 3 hours later, having hiked up the mountain, we had to walk through a small room and be blessed by the deities painted on its walls and ceiling before entering the grounds of Tengboche Monastery. The lamas visualize these male and female deities as they chant, seeking union with their own Buddha natures, the inborn capacity for compassion and wisdom. Tengboche Monastery, elevation 12,787 feet, was founded in 1923. By the time that our camp was established behind the monastery, the entire area was shrouded in fog. Day 18 of our trek was another rest day. It was now necessary to slow our pace. Ascending too rapidly could result in mountain sickness, a potentially fatal disorder. The morning air was freezing, and Michelle's towel froze stiff as a board. After breakfast, I explored the monastery. The Sherpas brought Tibetan Buddhism to Nepal with them when they migrated from Tibet about 600 years ago. The teachings of the Buddha had developed a unique and colorful character under the creative influence of the Tibetans. By the time I left the monastery, the sun had warmed the air, and the snow-covered peaks that surrounded us stood out clearly against the blue sky. After 18 days of trekking up and down these rugged mountain trails, Purba's sneakers were torn apart. He took the opportunity provided by this rest day in Tengboche to repair them. October 22nd, after a day of acclimatizing to the high altitude, we were ready to resume our journey. Our staff broke camp and packed the gear onto the yak and zomchuk. Unlike people, yak have to stay in the higher elevations or they become ill. Looking across the steep gorge from Tengboche, I could see the trail we would climb to Portsea that morning. 2.5 hours later, having descended to the river and made the tiring climb up the mountainside, I gazed back across the gorge to Tengboche. Kantega Himal, 22,340 feet, towered above the monastery. At 12,672 feet, Portsea is the last permanently inhabited village in this area. Farming in this remote region is limited to only a few patches of sandy soil on ledges. After camp was established on a terraced field behind a Sherpa home, we dined on boiled potatoes. These small potatoes, dipped in salt, are a staple food for Sherpas living in the remote and inhospitable Khumbu region of the Great Himalayas. Next morning, we continued to follow the trail high above the river northward towards Gokyo, our destination at 15,700 feet. The massive walls of Khumbu dominated the landscape. People are dwarfed by these giants, yet we dare to challenge their erratic moods and their colossal heights. Yarses, areas used for grazing yak and other animals during the warmer months, occur wherever there is a flat spot on the steep mountainside. After lunch, the rest of the group walked ahead as I dallied along the trail shooting film. Passing through this deserted, fog-engulfed Yarsa, I felt very alone and far away from all that was familiar to me. The fog gave an eerie quality to the temporary stone village. Yet this remote area, made very quiet by the blanket of fog, was strangely beautiful and very peaceful. The glacial river below us flowed southward through the barren, rugged mountains. We were now trekking more than 14,000 feet above sea level. We camped in a yarsa called Chaum that afternoon. The damp fog and high altitude combined to create temperatures below freezing by 2 p.m. When we awoke the morning of October 24th, the 20th day of our trek, the air was cold and crystal clear. Directly across the deep and narrow river valley next to us, the jagged mountain peaks stood stark against the cloudless, clear blue sky. The Himalayas, formed by the continuing collision of the Asian and Indian continental plates, are the youngest as well as the tallest mountains on Earth. Wind and weather have not yet had the time to smooth their sharp and jagged peaks. As we continue to trek northward, Cho Yo, 26,904 feet, loomed directly ahead of us. We were now trekking on the roof of the world, and the environment was alien yet breathtakingly beautiful. At an elevation of about 15,000 feet, we entered a glacial moraine. Countless stones and boulders deposited here by a glacier moving off the giant mountains. The uneven and unstable terrain, consisting of hills and valleys of stones, was very difficult to cross, and it was easy to lose one's bearings and sense of direction while down in one of the valleys. One of our group developed acute mountain sickness while crossing the moraine. Disoriented and feeling intense pain and pressure in her head, she could not go on. Unable to see the rest of us, she panicked and cried out for help. We found her in a matter of minutes and immediately descended 1,500 feet to an elevation where she began to feel better and regain her composure. We spent the night at this lower elevation, and next morning, feeling okay, she continued to descend towards Lukla while the rest of us resumed our ascent to Gokyo. When we finally arrived at Gokyo the next day, unlike our porters who seemed unaffected by the high altitude, I was short of breath, had a headache, and found any exertion very difficult. Yet, standing beside the beautiful lake, surrounded by snowy peaks, I was exhilarated and felt an enormous sense of accomplishment. icy water of the main lake at Gokyo is fed by the glacier on the mountainside above it. Our ultimate goal was the top of this mountain, the 18,000-foot high Gokyo Peak. We planned to rest and acclimatize the remainder of the day and trek up Gokyo Peak early next morning. Snow! We awoke next morning surprised to find it was snowing. Fearing that we would get snowed in, we decided to descend as far as we could that day. We continued to descend, walking through Machurma at 14,388 feet. The snow fell heavily. The trail was now treacherous. A wrong step or slip on an icy rock could have resulted in a slide to the river below. After descending what felt like an eternity, we reached 13,000 feet. We were now below the level of the storm. Descending still further, we reached the Du Kosi below Portse by late afternoon. We were tired, cold, and wet, but very relieved to know that we would be able to camp on relatively dry ground that evening. October 26th. We climbed away from the river, and looking across the valley, I saw Portse, Amadablam in the distance, and Tengboche Monastery, whose roof was still covered with snow from the previous day's storm. The sun climbed high enough to reach into the narrow mountain gorge by 10:30 that morning, and we stopped to enjoy its warming rays. Feeling warm for the first time in several days, we continued toward the village of Khumbu. As much as I had enjoyed the barren, high mountain area, I was happy to be back among the flowers and greenery. Khumbu is the second largest Sherpa village in the Khumbu area. Living as they do on the roof of the world, surrounded by many of the highest peaks on Earth, it's little wonder that the Sherpas have become famous for their mountaineering skills and daring. Sherpa children learn and practice climbing skills at a young age. After having lunch in yet another of Angnima's cousins' homes, we left Khumbu, walking past the long Maniwalan stupa that greet all who enter and leave the village by this route. We climbed about an hour, reached the ridge, and this time descended into Namche Bazaar and Angkami's house. As they are placed in all Sherpa homes, large shiny brass pots lined the shelves that stood all along one side of the living quarters. With traditional Sherpa hospitality, we were served a hot cup of salt and yak butter tea upon our arrival. After tea, we went down to the bazaar to buy Purba and several of the other porters new sneakers. Theirs had been torn to shreds by trekking on the stony mountain trails. Working as porters during the trekking season is the only opportunity these young men have to earn cash for themselves and their families for use during the rest of the year.
I awoke the morning of October 28th to the sounds of Angkami's father chanting his morning prayers. This rhythmic intonation of the Buddhist scriptures has echoed throughout these mountains for hundreds, perhaps even thousands of years.
I departed Namche with a great deal of sadness. We were leaving the Khumbu, the high country, and the many Sherpa friends that we had made. My sadness didn't last long, however. As we returned to the warmer and more fertile lands at even slightly lower elevations, my spirits lifted considerably. At more than 10,000 feet, we were still high in the mountains anyway. We camped beside the Dud Kosi at Pak Ding that evening. October 29th. Tired from weeks of trekking, I nevertheless felt elated at being near the successful completion of this arduous trek. 26 days after setting off on foot from Lamusangu, we walked into Lukla. The airstrip at Lukla was built by Sir Edmund Hillary in 1965 as part of a hospital project for this area. Cut into a shelf on the side of a steep mountain, the runway is 330 feet higher on its upper end than it is on its lower. It accommodates the twin-engine Otter aircraft that flies trekkers in and out of Lukla as the weather permits. October 30th. We weren't scheduled to fly out of Lukla for 2 more days, but we awoke early anyway and joined the crowd of trekkers waiting for the plane to arrive. Standing around, I met the Spanish climbers again. One of them had drawn a cartoon of me filming his friends singing and dancing at Lamjura Pass.
At about 9 a.m., I could see a small plane approaching in the distance. It landed safely, and after a cigarette break, the pilot flew it back to Kathmandu. About 1 hour later, news spread quickly through Lukla that this plane had crashed, killing all aboard, including the pilot who moments ago sat next to me smoking his cigarette. We were all stunned.
Not every plane that flies into Lukla makes it out again. Similarly, not every trekker that hopes to fly out does so on the day that he or she expects to. An unfavorable weather pattern developed the day we were scheduled to leave. I arose before dawn on 5 consecutive days, checking to see if the fog that made flying in and out impossible had broken. When I realized that it would take at least 18 days to walk back to Lamusangu, I knew how remote and isolated we truly were. By the time the fog finally cleared the morning of November 6th, the situation had grown rather tense. 350 trekkers had crowded into Lukla and all wanted to get out. Everyone realized that we could get trapped for days or weeks if the weather turned bad again. To top things off, there were rumors that Lukla was running out of food. Nepal Airlines was aware of the tense nature of the situation, and on November 6th, the 34th day of our trek, they flew a so-called rescue mission, managing to fly every trekker out of Lukla in 1 day. When my turn to fly came, I nervously crammed into the small aircraft with 15 others, and in a matter of moments, we were airborne.
As we gained altitude, the winds tossed the plane about like it was a toy. I knew I wasn't the only one aboard praying for a safe landing in Kathmandu. It took us only 35 minutes to fly over the area it had taken us 26 days to cross by foot. We were a happy and relieved group of trekkers as we landed in Tribhuvan Airport, Kathmandu, ending our amazing 34-day journey to the top of the world.